To understand the roots of today's complex economic and political problems, we need to analyze how the modern world order was built. I'll explain this on our Economic and Financial History channel through a series of 5 videos. If you're ready, we're diving deep into economics, so buckle up. The economic and political foundation of the modern world is largely based on the outcomes of 2 critical events: the Bretton Woods Conference, held in July 1944, and the Potsdam Conference, held in July 1945. While the Bretton Woods Conference shaped the post-war economic order of the Western world, the Potsdam Conference defined the political division between the Soviet Union and the Western Bloc after the war. The Bretton Woods Conference was held while World War II was still ongoing, and 44 countries, big and small, participated, with the United States and the United Kingdom leading the way. The Soviet Union was also among the participants. The British delegation was led by the famous economist John Maynard Keynes, while the U.S. delegation was led by economist Harry Dexter White. The system was built largely around White's ideas. We should remember that Keynes's argument for establishing a single world central bank was, in a sense, realized only many decades later, after the 2008 global financial crisis, when central banks began to act in very close coordination. White, the mastermind behind what would become a very successful Bretton Woods system, was also the architect of the famous Morgenthau Plan. The Morgenthau Plan was a detailed model proposing that post-war Germany should be turned into a purely agricultural country. When this plan leaked to the press, Nazi propaganda minister Goebbels used it masterfully, dramatically boosting the morale and resistance of the exhausted German army, prolonging the war. To this date, we still don't know who leaked the plan, but I suspect that well-known modern figures like Julian Assange and Edward Snowden might have been inspired by this mysterious individual. Later on, accusations emerged suggesting that White may have been a significant Soviet spy. His untimely death didn't close the subject. It remained a major point of debate until very recently. The Bretton Woods system designated the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency of the system, pegged it to gold, 35 USD per ounce, and tied other currencies to the U.S. dollar through adjustable pegged exchange rates. At the end of World War II, about 65% of the world's gold reserves were under U.S. control. The IMF was established to oversee this monetary system, provide liquidity to member countries facing balance of payments problems, and act as a general economic advisor. Another institution born out of Bretton Woods was the World Bank. Together with the Marshall Plan, it played a leading role in rebuilding Europe after the war. From 1945 to the early 1970s, the Bretton Woods Order delivered steady economic growth and stability to the Western world. It enabled the post-war Western nations and Japan to grow richer, strengthen their democratic institutions, and establish social peace. Ironically, the former defeated enemies, West Germany and Japan, were the countries that benefited the most from this system. Immediately after the end of the war in Europe, the Potsdam Conference was held. It was a crucial political gathering where the United States and the United Kingdom, together with the Soviet Union, defined their spheres of influence around the world. When the newly minted U.S. President Truman entered the conference, he had 2 powerful cards in his hand: the overwhelming strategic air power of the USAAF, which had devastated Germany and Japan, and the first successful atomic bomb test results from Los Alamos rushed to him just in time for the conference. Truman didn't hesitate to use these cards against Stalin. But Stalin's cards weren't bad either. The Soviet army, which had inflicted 85% of all German military losses and had achieved near perfection in strategic command and firepower by the end of the war, and Soviet political and military control over the liberated nations of Central and Eastern Europe. The Western Allies walked into the conference considering the uncertainties in cost and duration of the still ongoing war with Japan, and the public pressure in every democratic country to end the war as soon as possible. Stalin, on the other hand, had to consider the exhausted economic and human condition of the Soviet Union. When the Potsdam Conference ended, both sides actually left the table unsatisfied. The unresolved issues of the conference became the foundation of the Cold War, which began in 1946. Right after the war, the United Nations was established as an institution where the victors shared power. The fact that the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, the US, the Soviet Union, now Russia, the UK, China, and France, still hold the same positions today tells us a lot about how firmly this system has been preserved. Today, the G4 countries, Germany, Japan, India, and Brazil, are fighting hard to gain permanent seats on the UN Security Council. NATO was established in 1949 to counter the Soviet Union's dominance in land forces. In response, the Soviets transformed their existing military structure into the Warsaw Pact in 1955. The fact that the Warsaw Pact does not exist while US-led NATO continues to grow shows just how dominant the US remains within this alliance. From 1946 onward, the Cold War quickly turned into a massive geopolitical game, something between Go and chess. Key events of this era include the Greek Civil War, the Communist coup in Czechoslovakia, 1948, the Berlin Blockade, 1948, the Chinese Civil War, 1949, the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, the East German Uprising, 1953, the First Vietnam War, 1946 to 1954, the Hungarian Uprising, 1956, the Suez Crisis, 1956, and the Cuban Revolution, 1960. We must also remember another major development. In 1951, under U.S. leadership, 48 countries signed the San Francisco Peace Treaty with Japan. Japan's incredible rise within the Western Bloc began shortly after this, and by the end of the Cold War, it had become the world's second-largest economy. However, the unresolved issues in this treaty, particularly Taiwan and the island disputes in the South China Sea, have become one of today's major geopolitical fault lines. The creation of Israel in 1948, along with the independence of Arab nations, triggered the Middle East conflict, an issue still shaping world politics today. Between 1946 and 1961, the arms race between the Soviets and the West resulted in the formation of the nuclear balance of terror. Yet this nuclear balance also prevented several crises from escalating into full-scale war. We saw this particularly clearly during the diplomatic efforts that ended the 1967 and 1973 Arab-Israeli wars, conflicts that could have brought the Soviets and the U.S. face to face. Both superpowers deeply understood how the doomsday machine had operated in July 1914, when the world stumbled into World War I almost overnight. During this period, Europe began showing signs of economic and political integration. In 1957, West Germany, France, the Benelux countries, and Italy founded the EEC, a modest economic cooperation organization at first. But throughout the Cold War, it evolved into a deeply integrated social, economic, and political union. After the Cold War, its pace of exponential and deepening accelerated dramatically. In the Soviet Union, after Stalin's death, Khrushchev, with remarkable domestic political skill, seized power and moved the country away from Stalinism. But despite his domestic talent, he was an incompetent actor in foreign policy. One of Khrushchev's biggest mistakes was mishandling the relations between the two major communist powers, the Soviet Union and China. Their split escalated so badly that border clashes occurred between the two countries in the 1960s. Today's Chinese and Russian leaders built the foundation of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization based on the lessons they learned from the Soviet-Sino split. Another forgotten legacy of Khrushchev is that he transferred Crimea from the Russian Soviet Republic to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. Being Ukrainian himself, Khrushchev made this gesture without ever imagining that the Soviet Union one day would collapse. The modern Crimea issue is a direct product of Khrushchev's decision. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, became the Soviet Union's first major defeat. The crisis ended Khrushchev's political career. Khrushchev tried to manage the crisis like a chess match, failing to see that it had turned into a rising-stakes Texas Hold'em poker game. He folded before the cards were shown, and lost. The crisis stripped the Soviet Union of its aura of invincibility, like a street fighter taking a heavy punch for the first time. The U.S., however, wasted its advantage from the Cuban Missile Crisis during the poorly managed Vietnam War, 1962 to 1973. The military, political, and economic consequences of America's defeat in Vietnam were severe. Economically, the outcome made the Bretton Woods system unsustainable. The United States had to abandon the gold pegging of the dollar, one of the core principles of Bretton Woods. Other currencies also abandoned their dollar pegs and moved to floating exchange rates. Then came the 1973 oil crisis, which triggered high inflation, low growth, high unemployment, and political instability across the Western world.
Yet, despite everything, the U.S.-led Western Bloc had a flexible political and economic system, quick to learn from mistakes and capable of producing new strategies. For example, after the disastrous American defeat against German armored divisions at the Kasserine Pass, Tunisia, 1943, the U.S. military turned the lessons learned into a major doctrine. America would never again launch a military operation without absolute air superiority. After the Vietnam defeat, the lesson was this: U.S. ground forces would always fight as part of a coalition led by the United States, never alone, never with massive troop deployments. Whenever possible, Washington would localize conflicts so the human cost would fall mostly on its allies. Despite abandoning the gold peg in the 1971 economic crisis, the U.S. managed to preserve the dollar's reserve currency power thanks to the Federal Reserve and the U.S. banking system's ability to create money. The same thing happened again after the 2008 global financial crisis. Even though the crisis started in the United States, America, using the right policies, was among the first to recover. Despite everything, the 1970s oil shocks, Europe's political turmoil, the Western world widened its advantage over the Soviet Union in economy, technology, productivity, and global prestige. The Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc were successfully encircled by a steel ring of countries: Western Europe, Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, South Korea, and Japan. The Soviet-Chinese split only made this encirclement stronger. During the 1970s, the Soviet economy began collapsing, even as oil prices hit all-time highs. The main reason was the Soviet Union's horribly inefficient use of production factors and the heavy burden of military spending. The effects of this collapse can still be seen today in the structural weaknesses of Russian industry. The economic problems faced by both blocs in the 1970s triggered agreements to limit nuclear testing and reduce the number and sophistication of nuclear weapons. In the early 1980s, as the Western world gained new momentum through supply-side and neoliberal economics, the Soviet Union suffered another blow: its disastrous intervention in Afghanistan. It's difficult to explain why Soviet strategists made such a mistake, especially when their economy was collapsing and the painful lessons of America's Vietnam experience were clear. But internal weaknesses of neoliberal economic policies, especially their lack of proper regulation, became one of the major causes of the 2008 global financial crisis. In the early 1980s, Western military initiatives led by the U.S. also left the Soviet Union behind in the expensive arms race. The shock this created within the Soviet military even triggered dangerous ideas such as preemptive war. But reason ultimately prevailed, and by 1990-1991, the Cold War ended with a Western victory. It's an enormous and fascinating story, far too large to cover here, how the Soviet Union, which inflicted 85% of all German losses in World War II and surpassed Germany in every category of weapon production, collapsed economically. After the Cold War, Germany finally signed a legally binding peace treaty, the Treaty on the Final Settlement with respect to Germany, burying the last ghost of World War II. Europe finally digested the Germany issue, which it had been chewing on since 1871, first in 1945 and legally in 1990. But this agreement, like the 1945 Potsdam Arrangements, had unresolved points. Today's U.S.-Russia tensions stem directly from these unresolved issues. The era shaped by globalization, the world we live in now, will be explained in the rest of this video series.
I kindly ask you to follow our Economic and Financial History channel, and I'll see you in the next episode of the series, Understanding Today's World Order.